I have loved taking a deeper look into prayer with all of you. And I hope that these videos have inspired a closer relationship with God for every one of us. This series on prayer is going to end on the most straightforward encouragement for you and for me to simply be resolute in prayer. With the new year coming up and resolutions getting made, let us resolve ourselves to prayer once again. One of the examples of resolute prayer in the Bible that I love is Nehemiah. At the outset, Nehemiah receives terrible news about the condition that the city of Jerusalem is in. What's his response? Prayer, of course. In Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 4, it says, "As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven." What follows in chapter 1 is a beautiful prayer from a faithful follower of God who is completely reliant upon God's goodness and grace. Make sure to read it for yourself today. But in this prayer, Nehemiah praises God, asks for him to listen, confesses the sins of Israel, reminds God of the covenant that he made with Moses, and then finally asks that God would make him successful in his efforts to restore Jerusalem. In chapter 2, we read about Nehemiah being before King Artaxerxes. Listen to chapter 2 and verse 5. "And the king said to me, 'Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart.' Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, 'Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?' Then the king said to me, 'What are you requesting?' So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, 'If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it.'" Did you notice what Nehemiah did? In the middle of this conversation with the most powerful ruler in the world, right after Artaxerxes asks what Nehemiah would request of him, it says in verse 5 that Nehemiah prayed to the God of heaven. This prayer probably wasn't a long-form prayer like we read in chapter 1, but it is equally important to the heart leading on God for guidance and security. As Nehemiah gets to Jerusalem and begins the huge task of repairing the entire city, his resolve in prayer doesn't waver or wane. Once people start opposing Nehemiah and his work, we see him pray twice in chapter 4 for God's support. From here on out, there is a prayer that Nehemiah prays often. And this prayer is first found in chapter 5, verse 19. "Remember for good, O my God, all that I have done for this people." Similarly, in chapter 6 and verse 9, "But now, O God, strengthen my hands." Again in chapter 6 and verse 14, "Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, O my God, according to these things that they did, and also the prophetess Noadiah and the rest of the prophets who wanted to make me afraid." In the final chapter, we see Nehemiah pray a prayer like this 4 times in verses 14, 22, 29, and 31, always asking God to remember. This is the prayer that defined Nehemiah. He prayed often and earnestly that God would see what he was doing and remember him because he was trying to act in a way that would please God. He's not trying to be self-congratulatory or arrogant, but instead he humbly brought the work of his hands to God in prayer. As Nehemiah asked God to remember what he had done, Nehemiah could not forget that God was the one who made his efforts successful. It's not by chance that Nehemiah was successful, and it isn't a coincidence that his opponents knew it was God who granted that success. Being resolute in prayer to the living God is what made Nehemiah find striking success. And by God's grace, may that be true of us.